My name is Norman Willis. I'm with NazareneIsrael.org. I've been studying the book of Revelation for about a dozen years now, and I want to share with you the things that I've learned. We're at a critical juncture in history, and this information is important to all of us, so that's why I'm offering it free of charge. I just want to share with you the things that I've learned. Think of them as words to the wise. We're going to take a detailed look at the book of Revelation and the end times. I'm going to show you some things you may not have seen before. These are things that altered my understanding of Scripture forever. I'm kind of a methodical person, and I don't like to take anything for granted. We're not going to leave any stone unturned. So we're going to go line by line through the book of Revelation. And I hope you're going to pause this video as we go and follow along in your own scriptures. Now, if you're not familiar with me, I always use the original Hebrew names. You might say Jehovah or the Lord. I'm going to say Yahweh, as that's his original Hebrew name. You might say God. I'm going to use the Hebrew term Elohim. You might say Jesus. I'm going to say Yeshua. And I give more explanation as to why I do those things at NazareneIsrael.org. But I got saved in the summer of 1999, and I was taught all about Y2K and the year 2000. And of course, we all thought the world was going to end on midnight, December 31st, 1999, and everyone was all in a panic. I was also taught that there was going to be a pre-tribulation rapture in the year 2000, followed by 7 years of what's called the tribulation. And I was taught that at that time, Yeshua, or you might say Jesus, would come to scoop us all up and back in the clouds and to take us all back to the land of Israel supernaturally. We would be given immortal bodies. We're going to rule and reign with him for 1,000 years, sitting on thrones and all that. It was a beautiful scenario, and I wanted it to happen that way. It was just such a beautiful scenario, so I waited for it. But 1999 came and went, and then the year 2000 came and went, and then the year 2001 came and went. And then we had 9/11 and the Twin Towers, and you've heard about that. Well, then we had the year 2002 came and went, and at that point I started to have questions. So I began studying deep into the book of Revelation. Now, I just wanted to know the truth. I wanted to know what's ahead. I want to know what the book says. So I tried to clear my mind out and just read and study and understand what the book of Revelation really said about the end times. Well, Revelation can be a difficult book to sort out because Revelation is a prophetic vision, and the themes in Revelation can get all interwoven and different tangled threads and themes. But my basic question I was approaching Revelation with was, when is the rapture? Is it pre-tribulation? Is it post-tribulation? Is it mid-tribulation? When is it? What did Scripture actually say? And as I studied, I started to see a number of things that didn't fit at all with what I had been previously taught. It's like that old saying about when you're trying to force square pegs into round holes. I look at Scripture like a big jigsaw puzzle. And when we're working on a puzzle, we don't want to force anything with a hammer. And what I began to see as I studied further and further into Scripture was the things I'd been taught went against the prophecies in Scripture. And the things I'd been taught, if they were true, would require the prophecies in Scripture to have to go forever unfulfilled. Now, in my understanding, we can't do that. That's a big no-no. For one example, in John chapter 10 and verse 35, we're told that the Scriptures cannot be broken. For another thing, the Messiah Yeshua said not to think he had come to do away with any of the prophecies over Israel. For example, in Matthew 5 and verse 17, he said, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the Torah or the prophets. I did not come to destroy them, but only in fulfillment of them." In verse 18, he says, "For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot, not one tittle will by any means pass from the Torah until all is fulfilled." It's passages like these that let us know we can't just throw the prophecies out if they don't happen to agree with our understanding of what's supposed to happen in the end times. If there's a difference of understanding between Scripture and our opinion, we're the ones that have to change. Now, I was taught that Yeshua would return in the clouds. He was going to come down to earth, scoop us up, and carry us back to Jerusalem supernaturally in a cloud. We would be given supernatural bodies, so we would rule and reign physically sitting right next to him for 1,000 years during a period of time I was told is called the millennium. Then I was also taught that Yeshua would go on to build what's called Ezekiel's temple, or sometimes it's called the millennial temple. This is written about in Ezekiel chapter 40 through 46, and I was taught that Yeshua would be the prince of that temple. Well, there were some problems with this. As I began to read Ezekiel 40 through 46 about this temple, for example, in Ezekiel 45 and verse 22, it says, "And on that day the prince shall prepare for himself and for all the people of the land a bull for a sin offering." I was taught that this prince would be Yeshua, but the problem is, if this prince is Yeshua, then why does he prepare a sin offering for himself? I always thought Yeshua was the sinless, spotless lamb, and that he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So why does the sinless Messiah need to prepare a sin offering for himself? And if this prince is not Yeshua, let's say Yeshua is here on earth for 1,000 years, and prince is a different person. The prince is a different person ruling and reigning over Israel. Wouldn't it create some kind of a conflict to have the conquering king, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, share his power and glory with this human prince in Ezekiel? Isaiah chapter 42 and verse 8 says, "I am Yahweh, that is my name. My glory I will not give to another, nor my praise to carved images." Well, we know at one level Yeshua is his Father. Now, his Father is greater than him, but he told Philip at the same time, he said, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." So if the Father's not going to share his glory with any man, why would Yeshua share his glory with a man? Let's take a look at another logical conflict. Ezekiel chapter 46 and verse 16. "Thus says Yahweh Elohim, if the prince gives a gift of some of his inheritance to any of his sons, it shall belong to his sons. It is their possession by inheritance." So that caused me to stop a minute. Is Yeshua going to take an earthly wife and have earthly sons? Of course not. So this prince can't be Yeshua. So who is it? But if Yeshua is physically here for 1,000 years, then how is there room for this other prince? Perhaps you've heard this. Again, Yeshua is going to catch us all up in a rapture and take us back to the land of Israel in a cloud. But how do we reconcile that with passages like Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 20, where it says, "Then they shall bring all your brethren for an offering to Yahweh out of all nations, on horses and in chariots and in litters, on mules and on camels, to my set-apart mountain Jerusalem, says Yahweh." Now, we can understand that perhaps the horses, chariots, litters, mules, and camels are a reference to the trains, planes, and automobiles of the modern era. But what part of that prophecy says Yeshua is going to take us back to the land of Israel in a cloud? There were lots of things that didn't make sense as I continued to study. But we're going to talk about some more of these things that didn't make sense. But before we do that, first we need to do a basic review of what's called the two-house theory. So just a quick review of Israel's history. First you had Abraham, then Isaac, and then Jacob. Jacob was later called Israel. Israel had 12 sons, who each went on to lead one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph was sold into slavery down in Egypt because of his dreams. Well, Joseph then prevailed, and the other brothers came down to be with him. So they were in Egypt for 430 years. And then Moshe, or Moses, brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Joshua brought them into the promised land, and then there was 480 years of judges. After the 480 years, then you had Kings David and Solomon, and after King Solomon, the kingdom split. This is historical fact. You can read about it in 1 Kings chapters 11 and 12. So we know the kingdom of Israel split into what's called two houses. We read about that in Scripture. It's historic fact. The 10 tribes in the north became called the house of Israel, or also called the house of Ephraim. The 2 tribes in the south became known as the house of Judah. It's very interesting to track what happened to these 2 houses of Israel. The house of Israel, or the house of Ephraim in the north, was taken into what's called the dispersion, or the Assyrian diaspora, and they became known as the lost 10 tribes of Israel. The house of Judah, or house of Jacob in the south, they had a different historical path. So first they went into the Babylonian exile for 70 years, then they came back in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. They were there in the 1st century. They're the Pharisees and the Sadducees that we read about in the New Covenant. Then they went into the Roman exile around 70 CE. They're also the same as the Jews we think of today, but the Jews as we know them today are only the 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. They're not the house of Israel. The Jews are the house of Judah, or the house of Jacob. When we read in Scripture about the house of Israel or the house of Ephraim, that's another group of people. For example, in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 22, when Yeshua answered and said, "I was not sent on his first trip, except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." This is a reference to the lost 10 tribes of Israel, of the northern kingdom. The reason the Jews of the southern kingdom didn't accept him on his first time around was because he wasn't sent to the house of Judah. He was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And that's how we know that those who follow Yeshua belong to the house of Israel, or the lost 10 tribes. Now, if we look in Scripture, we also see that the apostles wrote to these lost tribes. For example, 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1 tells us Peter, or Kepha, an apostle of Yeshua Messiah, to the pilgrims of the Assyrian dispersion, or the diaspora, in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. He's writing to these lost 10 tribes. James 1 and verse 1 says, Yaakov, or James, a bondservant of Elohim and of the Adon Yeshua Messiah, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Greetings. Now we explain why James writes to 12 tribes instead of just 10 in the Nazarene Israel study. Some of the Jews had been dispersed and had never come back home. But what we see here, what we're going to see in Revelation chapter 7, starting in verse 6, we're going to see in this study that the 144,000 come from the 12 tribes. For example, in verse 6 it says, of the tribe of Asher, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000 were sealed. Now notice it doesn't say of the Baptists 12,000 were sealed. Of the Methodists 12,000 were sealed. Of the Seventh-day Adventists 12,000 were sealed. It only speaks of the 12 tribes of Israel. So if you don't self-identify as one of the 12 tribes of Israel, how are you going to be part of the 144,000? We talk about that in the Nazarene Israel study as well. But now let's take a look at Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 18. We're going to see these two houses again. Speaking of a future time, it says, and in those days the house of Judah, which is the southern two tribes, or the Jews, shall walk with the house of Israel, meaning these northern 10 tribes. And they shall come together out of the land of the north, to the land that I have given as an inheritance to your fathers. Well, what part of walk says Yeshua will take us back to the land of Israel in a cloud? Speaking of another future prophecy, Hosea chapter 1 and verse 11 says, then the children of Judah, that's the southern kingdom, the 2 tribes again, and the children of Israel, that's the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, shall be gathered together and shall appoint for themselves one head. Then they shall come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Now if we think about this for a minute, when the 2 houses appoint their one single leader, doesn't that speak of an election? Now, when the Messiah, the conquering king, returns, are we going to elect him? And if we did, would the conquering king care? Now, if the conquering king wouldn't care who gets elected, then who is it that gets elected? It has to be a human being. So let's consider again. Now we do know that Yeshua returns in the clouds. We're told this in Acts chapter 1, starting in verse 9. It says, "Now when he had spoken these things, and while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, 2 men stood by them in white apparel, who also said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This same Yeshua, who was taken from you up into heaven, will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven," meaning he's going to come back in a cloud. Well, if Yeshua returns in the clouds, then how do we explain passages like Jeremiah 30, starting in verse 7, which says, "Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It's the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. For it shall come to pass in that day, says Yahweh of hosts, that I will break his yoke from your neck, and I will burst your bonds. Foreigners shall no more enslave them, but they shall serve Yahweh their Elohim, and David their king, whom I will raise up for them." Now we basically have 2 options here. Either the original King David is physically resurrected from the grave, or else someone comes in the power and spirit of King David, much like John the Baptist came in the power and spirit of Elijah or Eliyahu. But either way, someone gets raised up. So if Yeshua comes down in the clouds, then who is David their king who gets raised up, who rules over Israel? We're also going to find he comes from the midst. In Jeremiah chapter 30 and verse 21, it says, "Their leader shall come from among them," speaking of this same general time frame, "and their governor shall come from their midst." But if Yeshua returns from the clouds, then who is it who comes from among them, and who is it who comes from their midst? The more I studied, the more passages I saw that just don't have anything to do. They don't fit with the standard classic rapture paradigms. There's things, they just don't mesh. I'm going to show you a lot more verses as we go along. Now, I'm just going to present to you the results of my studies. Now, these are just my ideas. You don't have to agree with me, and I would prefer that you study these things out for yourself. I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to read and study your scripture so you know what you believe and why you believe it. But just relax and let me paint a picture for you and see if this makes sense to you. Now, as I was studying Revelation by myself and with some others, what we found is the book of Revelation has a timeline built right into it. And all the rest of the end time prophecies in scripture plug right into that timeline. Now, it's really convenient and it answers a lot of questions. You know, when I was a child, I used to love to do puzzles. We'd get puzzles in the middle of winter, and you know how you do a puzzle is first you find the 4 corners, and then you complete the framework, and then you start to piece things together in the middle. Now, we don't have the entire picture all put together, but I believe we have the 4 corners, the borders, we have the complete framework, and we have a majority of the things in the middle. So there may be a few details we have off, some things we don't know about, but what I'd like you to see is just take a look at the framework and the 4 corners and the middle that we've presented and see if it makes sense to you. Now, during this presentation, when we get into the actual meat of the study, we're going to be talking about what I call the simplified chart. If you want the full chart, you can find that either in the book or on the Nazarene Israel website. And we sell all of our works at cost. We don't make money by selling the presentations. But I want to show you just a brief overview of the simplified chart. So we're going to take a look at this chart, and what we're going to see is we have seals, trumpets, thunders, and cups. Now the seals are going to take a long time. We're going to talk about these a lot more. The seals are going to take a long time to play out, basically hundreds of years. The trumpets are the tribulation period. We believe that's a time frame of about 7 years, the second half of that being what's called the time of Jacob's trouble. The cups or the bowls, some people call them the vials, happen relatively quickly. They happen in about a 30-day span of time. Then we have the Battle of Armageddon, then comes the ingathering, and then the millennium. Now, I want to show you something else, and this is really important. We're going to talk about, and I believe this is one of the reasons why the book of Revelation has been misunderstood for so long. And if you get this, if you understand this, the book of Revelation is going to make a lot more sense to you. Basically, Revelation's broken down into what we call the timeline or the chronology and the insets. Now, the timeline basically is the storyline. First this happens, then that happens, then something else happens. When you see a movie, you go to the theater, things happen in a chronological sequence or in a book. Now, you might read about a flashback. This is where the insets come into. If you watch a movie, you'll have a flashback. That's going to give you more information with which to understand the chronology and how things are playing out. If you're looking or researching something on the internet, you can click a hyperlink, and that's going to take you to another site where you can find more information. That's what these insets are like. You might be reading in a textbook, and you'll have like a sidebar or a breakout session. Again, that's what these insets are like. Don't let the insets throw you off the trail of the timeline. It's very important. First, we have the 7 seals. This is going to be releasing forces. We're going to talk about this in part number 1. Then we're going to have an inset. So the 7 seals belong to the timeline. Then we're going to come to our first inset chapter. It's going to be discussing the 144,000. After we talk about the inset of the 144,000, we're going to be returned to the timeline at seal number 7. Now, interesting pattern. Seal 7 is going to open up the 7 trumpets. And again, the trumpets are the time of tribulation. Now, the last 3.5 years is the time of Jacob's trouble, according to this model, according to this theory. In the time of Jacob's trouble, we have what's called the 7 thunders. They're sealed up. We don't even know what they are, but they happen during the time of Jacob's trouble. Then from there, we have the 2 witnesses. So the 2 witnesses is another inset chapter. Again, after we discuss the 2 witnesses, then the 7th trumpet sounds, and that's when Babylon falls, and we'll see Yahweh's kingdom is set up. And that 7th trumpet is going to open up the 7 cups. But before we can get to the 7 cups, first we're going to have 3 inset chapters. We're going to have chapter 12, which talks about the woman and child. Then chapter 13, which talks about the beasts from the sea and the land. And then chapter 14 talks about the 2 harvests. Okay, after the 3 inset chapters, we're going to come back to the timeline. We're going to see 7 cups or 7 bowls. Some versions call it 7 vials. Then we're going to see inset of the 3 frogs, which are unclean demons. And then at the end of that inset, then we're going to have cup number 7 is going to bring us back to the timeline again. Cup number 7 will carry us in the timeline to Armageddon, but before we get there, first we're going to read chapters 17 and 18, which are inset chapters. They're going to describe Babylon and Rome and her fall. By the time we return to the timeline, we're going to come to Armageddon. This is 75 days after the 7th trumpet. This is also the first war of Gog and Magog. That's the time frame when Yeshua returns and takes his bride to the wedding feast. Then we're going to see the ingathering, or the second Exodus. There's going to be some surprises. By the time we get to the millennium, or the 1,000 years, what we're going to see, and you may think this is completely crazy, you may think this is completely nuts. I'd like you to check this out. After you watch this presentation, I'd like you to check this out in your own scriptures. The saints are in heaven with the Messiah during this time frame, because we've already seen several passages, and we're going to see several more that show us a logical conflict if the Messiah is here at the same time frame as the prince of Ezekiel's temple. The resolution is the Messiah does come in the clouds, does take his bride, and takes his bride back to the throne room in heaven, which is where the saints sit on thrones for 1,000 years. At the end of that 1,000 years, we're going to see the second war of Gog and Magog. Satan is going to be loosed from his pit, and then there's going to be another war, second war of Gog and Magog. after which the earth is going to continue a little while. We'll talk more about that later. After that comes the great white throne judgment and the new earth. Now, that's the overview. So what I'd like to do now, if you're ready, let's go on to the main presentation. We're going to see all this information again, and we're going to take a much closer look at how Revelation has been fulfilled historically and how it will be fulfilled in the future. Please join me again for part number 1 of Revelation and the End Times.